Beneath a broken diner sign in the Wyoming snow, a retired Navy SEAL found a German shepherd curled around an old burgundy scarf. Callan Brennan thought he was only bringing home a lost dog for the night. But Haven was not lost. She was waiting. By morning, her trembling paws led him past the abandoned diner to a closed motel at the edge of Red Basin. Behind that motel, 3 elderly women were sleeping in their cars, forgotten by paperwork and winter. And before the storm was over, the people pushed outside would become the ones who kept the fire alive. Stay with this story. Tell us where you're watching from, and if it touches your heart, please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers and keep these stories coming. By the end of December, Red Basin, Wyoming, looked less like a town and more like a handful of stubborn lights refusing to surrender to the white dark. The highway ran past it in a long, wind-scoured line, cutting through frozen sagebrush flats and low hills crusted with snow. During the day, the land shone pale and open, almost gentle. At night, when the wind came down hard from the ridges, everything changed. Fence wire hummed. Road signs trembled on their posts. Snow lifted off the ground in thin, ghostly sheets, as if the earth itself were trying to leave. Callan Brennan lived 12 miles beyond town in a cabin set back from an old ranch road. He was 49 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with a kind of strength that had gone quiet instead of soft. His face was long, weathered, and deeply lined around the eyes, as though time had not struck him all at once, but carved him with patience. His nose had been broken years ago and never set quite straight. His beard was short and boxed, dark brown, threaded with silver at the chin. His hair, brown with ash gray at the temples, stayed clipped short on the sides, but never neat for long in Wyoming wind. Most people in Red Basin knew he had once been a Navy SEAL. Fewer knew he had been an orphan before he had ever worn a uniform. Callan preferred it that way. He had learned early that people asked about war with a kind of cautious respect, but they asked about childhood with pity. He had no use for pity. Pity was a warm blanket people handed you just long enough to feel generous before taking it back. The cabin suited him because it did not ask questions. It had a working lock, a wood stove, a narrow bed, a gun safe, a shelf of tools, and enough silence to keep a man from having to explain himself. To Callan, that was what a house was: 4 walls, a roof, and a door that could be shut from the inside. Home was a word other people used when they had photographs on refrigerators. He had none. There were no Christmas lights on his porch, no wreath on the door, no spare mug waiting for company. A pair of boots stood by the stove. A field jacket hung from a peg. A row of repaired tools lined the workbench in the back room with more dignity than most furniture. That night, Callan drove home from Red Basin with a sack of stove bolts, coffee, and canned soup riding on the passenger seat of his old truck. He wore his olive drab combat shirt beneath a dusty tan canvas coat, the shirt's camouflage sleeves worn pale at the elbows, faint horizontal bands still visible around the biceps. Snow had not yet begun to fall in earnest, but the sky had the metallic brightness that came before a storm, the whole world lit by some cold forge behind the clouds. He passed the closed gas station first, then the empty feed store, then the long shoulder where trucks sometimes pulled over when the pass ahead shut down. A mile farther stood Starline Diner. It had been closed for 3 winters. Once, old-timers said, it had served pie thick enough to count as architecture and coffee, strong enough to make a preacher confess things he had not done. Now the windows were boarded from the inside, the parking lot cracked and half swallowed by weeds, the roof sagging under old snow. The sign was the only thing that still moved. It hung crooked above the front, one metal support broken, the neon letters flickering in the wind. Starline should have glowed red and blue. Only line remained, blinking weakly through blowing snow. Callan nearly drove past. Then something dark shifted beneath the sign. His foot left the gas. The truck rolled another 20 feet before he pulled onto the shoulder. For a moment he sat with both hands on the wheel, watching through the windshield. Snow scratched sideways across the glass. The broken sign swung once, whining on its remaining bracket. There it was again. Not trash, not a tarp, an animal. Callan killed the engine. The sudden silence pressed around him. He opened the door and stepped out into the cold. Wind cut across the lot, needling through the seams of his coat. His boots crunched over thin ice as he moved toward the diner, one slow step at a time. Under the broken sign, half tucked against the base of a rusted post, lay a German shepherd, female from the shape of her head and frame, black and gold, though the colors were dulled by snow and road grime. Her back carried a dark saddle like a charred cloak. Her chest and forelegs were honey gold, wet and clumped with frost. One ear stood tall. The other tilted slightly, its edge nicked near the top. Beside her front paws lay a burgundy wool scarf. The dog did not bark when Callan approached. She lifted her head just enough to look at him. That was worse. A frightened dog that barked still believed noise might save it. This one had the tired, watchful gaze of a creature measuring how much harm the world could do if she moved too quickly. Her amber eyes fixed on Callan's face, not pleading, not trusting, only aware. Callan stopped 6 steps away. "Easy," he said. His voice came out rough from disuse, not harsh, just unpracticed. The dog's body tightened. Her back leg trembled once and then tucked closer under her. Snow had collected along her spine and around her muzzle. When she breathed, it showed faint and fast in the cold. Callan crouched, slowly enough that his knees had time to complain. He did not reach for her. Men ruin things by reaching too soon. A memory came to him without permission. A black garbage bag on a foster home porch, tied at the top, his school shoes inside, his clothes smelling like someone else's laundry soap. He had been 8 or 9. The homes had blurred after a while. The bag had not. It had sat beside him like a second child no one wanted to introduce. He looked at the dog under the broken sign. "You get moved out, too?" he murmured. The dog's good ear twitched. Callan shrugged out of his canvas coat. The cold bit immediately through his combat shirt, sinking into the olive fabric and the camouflage sleeves. He laid the coat on the snow halfway between them, lining side up. The dog watched the movement. Her eyes dropped to the coat, then returned to his hands. "No tricks," Callan said. "No speeches either. Lucky for both of us." The sign creaked overhead. The dog lowered her nose toward the burgundy scarf and touched it once, as if making sure it was still there. The gesture was small, but it changed the shape of the moment. She was not simply guarding herself. She was guarding that ragged strip of wool like it belonged to someone who had not come back. Callan felt an old tightness settle under his ribs. He had known men who carried photographs into war, letters, a child's drawing folded into a pocket, a lucky coin. The object was never just the object. It was a small country of memory a person could hold when the rest of the world turned hostile. This dog had a scarf. He stayed where he was until the wind shifted and brought the first thicker flakes of snow across the lot. The storm was gathering itself. "All right," he said quietly. "We can distrust each other indoors." The dog did not move. Callan opened the truck door and took out an old wool blanket he kept behind the seat. He spread it on the ground near the coat, then stepped back again. The shepherd's nostrils worked. She stretched her neck an inch, stopped, then dragged the burgundy scarf closer with her teeth, not leaving it. Callan understood that too. He waited. It took nearly 10 minutes for her to put one paw on his coat, another 3 before she shifted her weight forward. When she tried to stand, her back leg shook so badly she almost collapsed. Callan moved one hand, then froze as her eyes sharpened. "Easy," he said again. "I know. Nobody likes being carried." The dog stared at him. Especially not by strangers with bad manners. Something in his own voice almost sounded like humor. It startled him more than the dog. When he finally lifted her, she was lighter than she should have been. Not starved to the bone, but reduced, worn down too quickly. Her body stiffened against his arms, yet she did not snap. She clamped the scarf between her teeth and held it there with a silent, desperate dignity while he carried her to the truck. The drive back to the cabin took longer than usual. Snow thickened fast, washing the headlights into tunnels of white. The dog lay on the passenger seat wrapped in the blanket, her scarf tucked under her chin. She did not sleep. Every few minutes, Callan felt her looking at him. "You picked a bad night," he said. Her ear flicked. "Or I did." At the cabin, he brought her inside and set her near the wood stove. The room was cold at first, the way his rooms often were when he returned after dark. He fed kindling into the stove, then split cedar, then one heavier log. Flame took slowly, blew at the base before it warmed to gold. The shepherd lay on the braided rug, head up, scarf between her paws. In the firelight, her coloring returned in pieces. The black saddle across her back, the pale gold chest, the uneven dark mask around her eyes, the bright streak of golden fur down her right cheek like a narrow brush of sunlight. Callan filled a bowl with water and set it down several feet away. She watched it as if water might have conditions attached. "Fair," he said. "Most things do." He called the only veterinarian he trusted within 40 miles. Dr. Miriam Vale arrived 40 minutes later, in a green field jacket and boots crusted white with snow. She was in her mid-50s, straight-backed, dark hair threaded with silver and tied loosely behind her neck. Her red veterinary bag looked older than some trucks in town. Miriam did not waste words when she stepped inside. "Show me the dog," she said, "then tell me what you did wrong." "Good to see you, too." "I assume you picked up a half-frozen German shepherd in a storm without gloves and brought her home before calling me." Callan glanced at his bare hands, still red from the cold. "Mostly accurate. Men your age are a public health problem." She knelt near the rug, but not too close. The shepherd lifted her head. Miriam lowered the back of her hand and waited. No sweetness, no baby talk, no sudden reach. After a long moment, the dog sniffed her knuckles. "Female," Miriam said. "Maybe 6. Mild hypothermia, dehydrated, cracked nails, pads scraped, underfed, but not long-term neglected. This decline is recent." "Recent how?" "A few weeks, perhaps. I'd need more than a floor exam to be precise." Miriam checked the dog with calm hands, pausing whenever the shepherd tensed. The dog endured it, though her eyes kept returning to the scarf. When Miriam tried to move it aside, the dog's jaw tightened. Miriam stopped. "Well," she said, "that matters." "What does?" "That she'll let me check her ribs, but not take the scarf." Callan looked at the strip of burgundy wool. The dog looked back at him. Miriam pulled a microchip reader from her bag, switched it on, frowned, and tapped it against her palm. The device blinked once, gave a weak chirp, and died. "Battery froze in the truck," she said. "I'll come back tomorrow if the roads allow. No visible tag?" "No." "Name?" Callan looked at the dog. Outside, the storm pressed against the windows. Inside, the stove clicked and breathed. The cabin, usually just a shelter of wood and locks, seemed to be listening. He had never liked naming things. Names made attachments. Attachments made absence. Absence had teeth. But the dog needed something warmer than dog, something better than stray, something that did not sound like paperwork. "Haven," he said. Miriam glanced at him. Callan kept his eyes on the shepherd. "Her name's Haven." The dog did not wag her tail. She did not rise, did not soften into gratitude. But her eyes shifted to him, steady and amber, and for one brief second, Callan had the strange feeling that the name had not been given so much as placed carefully beside her, like the coat in the snow. Miriam left him with instructions. Small amounts of water, small meals, warmth, no crowding, no sudden handling. Call if breathing changed, call if she refused water by morning, call if anything seemed wrong. After the vet's taillights disappeared into the storm, Callan stood in the cabin's quiet with the instruction sheet in his hand. He set a little softened food near the rug. Haven sniffed it, but did not eat. She drank twice, cautiously, then lowered her head again onto the scarf. Callan sat in the old wooden chair by the stove and pretended not to watch her. The fire warmed the room. Snow gathered along the windowsills. Wind moved around the cabin like something large and restless, testing every seam. Near midnight, Haven stood. Callan opened his eyes at once. He had not realized he had been sleeping. The dog took the burgundy scarf carefully in her teeth. Slowly, stiffly, she walked to the front door. She set the scarf on the floorboards before it, then sat facing the dark window beside the frame. Callan did not speak. Haven waited. Not to go out. Not exactly. Her body did not lean toward escape. She sat like a guard at a gate, like a widow at a station platform, like a creature keeping faith with someone who had failed to arrive. Callan felt the room alter around him. For years, this cabin had held only what he allowed: tools, heat, canned food, silence. Now a second breathing life sat at his door with a scarf in front of her, and that life belonged to a sorrow with a direction. The dog was here, but her waiting was elsewhere. Callan rose and crossed the room slowly. He stopped beside her, leaving space between them. Outside, Wyoming vanished behind the snow, white and unknowable. The broken sign at Starline Diner would be swinging in that same wind, blinking its wounded little word into the storm. Line, a road, a boundary, a thread. Callan looked down at Haven. "All right," he said, though he did not know yet what he was agreeing to. Haven did not turn from the door. The burgundy scarf lay between them like a question neither of them was ready to answer. And for the first time in years, Callan Brennan stood inside his own house and felt that something in it was not locked, not finished, not his alone. Somewhere beyond the storm, someone was missing this dog, and this dog had not stopped waiting. Morning came bright and cold, the kind of Wyoming morning that made the world look innocent from a distance. Snow had fallen through the night, not enough to bury the land, only enough to soften its hard edges. The sagebrush beyond Callan Brennan's cabin wore white on every twisted branch. The fence posts stood like old sentries with frost on their shoulders. Far off, the highway was a dull gray ribbon under the pale sky, almost peaceful, as if it had not spent the night dragging wind past every loose board in the county. Inside the cabin, the wood stove had burned down to a bed of red coals. Callan woke in the chair by the stove with a stiff neck and one boot half unlaced. For a moment, he did not move. Old habits counted sounds before the mind fully returned. Wind at the eaves, stove ticking, his own breathing. Then another sound, a soft scrape near the door. Haven stood where she had sat hours before, the burgundy scarf gathered in her mouth. She had not slept well. That much was plain. Her black and gold coat had dried in rough patches, and the bright streak of gold down her right cheek caught the morning light from the window. Her amber eyes were clearer than they had been the night before, but not calmer. A body could warm faster than a fear. Callan sat up slowly. "Morning," he said. Haven watched him. "I don't suppose you learned English while I was asleep." Her torn right ear tilted, not quite upright, not quite folded. She kept the scarf between her teeth. Callan stood, every joint filing a complaint. He checked her water bowl, lower than before. Good. The food he had left had been touched only once or twice, the surface disturbed in careful half-moons. Not enough, but enough to say she had chosen living for another few hours. He opened the cabin door to let out the heavy overnight air. Haven moved before he could stop her, not fast, not frantic. She stepped past him onto the porch, scarf still in her mouth, and stood at the top of the steps with her nose turned toward the highway. Callan felt the cold hit his chest through the olive combat shirt. He had not put on his coat yet. Snowlight filled the yard, clean and sharp. Haven did not look at the woods. She did not sniff the porch rail or the stacked firewood or the old path to the tool shed. She looked east, toward Red Basin, toward Starline Diner, toward whatever had put that scarf in her mouth and a waiting place inside her ribs. Callan leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" Haven took one step down. Her back leg shook. She stopped, gathered herself, and took another. Callan swore softly, not at her, at the morning, at the road, at whatever person was missing a dog and had failed to appear out of the snow with an explanation. He got his coat, boots, gloves, and keys. 10 minutes later, his truck rolled slowly down the ranch road, while Haven sat on the passenger seat, wrapped in the wool blanket. She had refused to lie down. Her paws braced against the seat, head lifted, scarf under her chin. Each time the truck passed a bend, her ears shifted, reading the road through scent and memory. Callan kept one hand loose on the wheel. He did not speak much. There was no point filling the cab with human noise just because silence made people nervous. Silence had never made him nervous. What bothered him was direction. Haven had one. They passed Starline Diner. The broken sign still hung crooked above the boarded windows. In daylight it looked smaller, less haunted, just bent metal and dead neon, snow crusted along the letters. Haven turned her head toward it, but she did not rise. She did not whine. Callan slowed anyway. "Here?" he asked. Haven looked beyond the diner. The old gas station came next, its pumps hooded in snow, the price sign blank, a crow sitting on the roof like a judge with nothing better to do. Beyond that, the highway dipped toward a stretch of low land where motels and equipment yards had once served truckers before the new bypass pulled most business north. Haven stood then. Her claws clicked against the seat. Callan eased off the gas. Ahead, a weather-faded sign rose from a drift beside the frontage road. Sundown Motor Lodge. The letters were yellow once, maybe cheerful in another life. Now they were dulled by wind and age, the word sundown half veiled in ice. The motel itself lay low and long against the snow, 2 rows of rooms forming a shallow U around a cracked parking lot. Doors had been chained shut. Windows were covered from the inside. Orange notices flapped under plastic sleeves on several doors. Temporary closure for safety inspection. Callan read the words from behind the windshield. He had seen enough official paper in his life to know that ink could be used like a lock. Haven gave a low sound in her throat. Not a bark, not fear exactly. Recognition, strained until it hurt. Callan turned into the lot. The truck tires crunched over packed snow and old gravel. No fresh plowing, no visible staff. The office window was dark, though a string of Christmas lights still hung unlit around the frame, their red and green bulbs cloudy with frost. Haven pressed toward the passenger door. "Wait." She did not. The moment Callan opened the door, she slid down awkwardly, landed with a limp, and nearly stumbled. Callan reached instinctively, then stopped himself. Haven recovered, scarf clenched in her teeth, and started along the front of the motel. Room 6, Room 8, Room 10. She passed each chain door without stopping. At Room 12, she froze. The door had been crossed with a heavy chain looped through the handle and bolted to an iron bracket. A plastic notice was taped at eye level. Snow had gathered along the threshold, thin and windblown, as if no one had stepped there in days. Haven lowered the scarf to the mat. Then she sat. Callan stood behind her, his breath rising white. The gesture was too deliberate to dismiss. A dog could return to a smell. A dog could follow habit. But this looked like ceremony, like placing flowers where a house used to be. Before he could bend to read the notice, Haven turned sharply toward the back of the property. Her ears lifted. Callan heard it then. A cough, not from inside the room. From beyond the row of units. He followed Haven around the side of the motel, past a frozen soda machine and a stack of old patio chairs tied with rope. Behind the building, in the narrow service lane, near the dumpster enclosure, 3 cars sat close together nose to tail. Old cars. A blue Buick with rust at the wheel wells. A white Subaru wagon with one mismatched door. A beige Mercury sedan whose rear window was covered from the inside with a quilt. The cars were running on and off, engines coughing to life only long enough to warm the interiors before shutting down again to save gas. Callan stopped. Haven did not. She went straight to the beige Mercury. Inside, behind fogged glass, someone moved. The driver's door opened with a groan. A woman in her 70s looked out at them from beneath a plum-colored winter hat. She was small, narrow-shouldered, wrapped in so many layers that she seemed made of sweaters and stubbornness. Her face was pale and thin, with fine lines around the mouth, but her eyes were sharp blue, awake despite exhaustion. For one heartbeat, she stared at Haven without understanding what she saw. Then her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh," she said. It broke out of her like pain. "Oh, my girl!" Haven made a sound Callan had not heard from her before. Not quite a whine, not quite joy. Something older and smaller. She lowered herself, crawling the last few feet through the snow with the scarf in her mouth, as if happiness itself might be punished if she approached too boldly. The woman dropped to her knees beside the car, careless of the cold. "Haven," she whispered. "Haven, baby, come here." Callan looked down. So he had named her correctly by accident. Or not by accident. He was not ready to think about that. Haven pressed into the woman's lap, her body trembling harder now than it had in the cabin. The woman held her with both arms, one hand buried in the thick fur at Haven's neck, the other shaking over the torn ear, the golden cheek, the ribs that showed more than they should. Behind the Subaru, another woman climbed out slowly, bracing one hand against the roof. She was broader than the first, with silver hair escaping a red knit cap, and a face that looked built for both laughter and scolding. She wore a man's old coat over a floral house dress and snow boots patched with duct tape. "Well, saints preserve us," she said. "Marjorie, that dog has better survival instincts than any of us." From the Buick, a third woman opened her door with icy dignity. She was tall and thin, wrapped in a dark wool coat, a notebook tucked under one arm even before both feet touched the snow. Her white hair was pinned neatly beneath a green scarf. She had the stare of someone who had once silenced rooms without raising her voice. "Ruth," she said, "do not make jokes while a miracle is still catching its breath." The broader woman sniffed. "Odessa, if I waited for proper timing, I'd never speak at all." Callan remained beside the truck lane, suddenly aware that he was an armed-looking stranger in a closed motel lot with 3 elderly women living out of cars and a dog he had found under a broken sign. He held both hands where they could see them. "My name is Callan Brennan," he said. "I found her last night near Starline Diner." The first woman looked up from Haven. "Marjorie Finn," she said, though her voice was still caught somewhere in the dog's fur. "She's mine." No one challenged that, not even the wind. Ruth Bellamy introduced herself by offering Callan coffee from a thermos, and then warning him it tasted like boiled cardboard with ambition. Odessa Pike gave her name as if entering it into a permanent record. Callan declined the coffee, but accepted the information their presence already gave him. 3 women, 3 cars. Bedding visible inside. Condensation on the windows. A small camping stove set on a metal tray near the wall, a plastic bin of canned goods under a tarp. This was not a morning errand. This was where they were sleeping. "How long?" Callan asked. Odessa answered before the others could soften it. 6 nights in the cars, 8 since our rooms were sealed, 3 since the voucher expired, 2 since the gas station told us we could not keep using their restroom unless we bought something every time. Ruth lifted a finger. Which, to be fair, we did. I now own enough peppermint gum to caulk a barn. Marjorie did not smile. Her hand kept moving over Haven as if counting the dog back into existence. Callan looked at room 12 visible around the corner. "You rented here?" "Long term," Odessa said. "Marjorie in 12, Ruth in 14. I was in 16. Month to month, yes, but paid. Receipts kept." "Of course you kept receipts," Ruth muttered. "Civilization depends on receipts." Marjorie finally reached for the burgundy scarf. Haven had dropped it across her knees. "I made this," she said. "Years ago. Too long. Too crooked. My husband said it looked like a road with a drinking problem." Her mouth trembled at the edge of memory. "Haven used to steal it whenever I went to the laundry room. She thought if she held it, I couldn't leave without her." Callan said nothing. A person could learn more from what someone touched than from what they explained. Marjorie's fingers tightened around the scarf. "I fell outside the office, ice under the mat. Delia took me to the clinic first. Then they sent me to Casper because my hip was worse than I thought. I was gone 3 weeks. Her eyes stayed on Haven. "When I came back, the room was chained. My things were in storage. My car was gone. Haven was gone." Ruth's face hardened. "Randall Cormack said she was not on the lease." "She was not furniture," Marjorie said softly. Odessa opened her notebook. New management declared no pets, retroactively, though Marjorie had already resided here before his acquisition. The wording was vague, conveniently. "New management," Callan repeated. Ruth snorted. "That means a man in clean shoes telling cold people it's not personal." Now Callan understood a little more. Not all of it. Enough. The notice on the doors, the closed office, the cars behind the building where passing drivers would not notice unless they looked, the voucher that had expired, the women keeping themselves alive by rationing gas and pride. He turned toward the motel. Every door in the row faced the empty parking lot like a mouth sewn shut. "What did they call the closure?" he asked. Odessa did not need to check her notes. "Temporary safety inspection due to heating irregularities." Was the heat failing? "In parts of the west row," Ruth said. "Not in our rooms. Mine was too hot half the time. I used to crack the bathroom window." "Randall said we had to leave for 72 hours, Marjorie added. "He gave us vouchers for a motel in Laramie, but Ruth doesn't drive at night, Odessa won't leave her records unattended, and I was still using a walker. By the time we sorted transport, the vouchers were no good." "Then came storage fees," Odessa said. "Then towing fees. Then a notice claiming abandoned tenancy." Ruth folded her arms. "Abandoned, while we were standing right here, yelling through the office door." Callan felt something inside him settle into a colder shape. There were violent men who broke things with fists. There were polished men who broke them with procedure. He had met both. The second kind often slept better. Haven rose from Marjorie's lap, shaky but determined. She took the scarf again, turned, and walked toward room 12. Marjorie tried to stand. Callan moved, but Ruth was faster, steadying her with an arm under the elbow. "Slow, Marge." "I know the speed of my own bones," Marjorie said, then winced and accepted the help anyway. They followed Haven around the corner. At room 12, the shepherd placed the scarf on the threshold, exactly where she had placed it before. Then she sat in front of the chain door and leaned her head against the cold wood. No one spoke. Even Ruth's humor stepped back. Callan looked at the door, at the chain, at the notice sealed in plastic. Then at Marjorie, who stood in the snow with one hand pressed flat against her chest as if the room beyond the door contained not belongings, but breath. He remembered, with an unwelcome clarity, a black garbage bag at his feet and a woman he barely knew saying, "It's just until they find another placement." He remembered wanting to ask if another placement had a smell, a bed, a kitchen, a way of knowing where to stand. He had not asked. Children learned early when questions made adults impatient. His own voice, when it came, was quiet. "What's inside?" Marjorie swallowed. "My husband's photographs, Haven's papers, some clothes, a wooden box, nothing worth much." Odessa's eyes flashed. "Worth is not determined by resale value." Ruth pointed at her. "That may be the first thing you've said all week that I'd stitch on a pillow." Callan looked at the chained door again. He could open it, not legally, not cleanly, but easily. The old bracket would give with the right pry bar in under a minute. His hand flexed once. Haven turned her head and looked at him, not asking him to break it, not asking him to leave it, only looking with that amber steadiness as if she knew doors were tests people either passed or became. Callan stepped back. "I won't cut the chain," he said. Marjorie's face fell before she could hide it. "Not because it should stay closed," Callan added, "because when it opens, I want it to stay open." The wind moved through the U-shaped motel and shook the paper notices against the doors. Odessa studied him for a long second, then nodded once. She approved of sentences that sounded like they might survive being written down. Ruth exhaled through her nose. "Well, that's either wise or extremely annoying." "Usually both," Callan said. It earned him the smallest laugh from Marjorie. Not much, barely a sound. But Haven's torn ear shifted toward it, as if the laugh were food. Callan looked from one woman to the next. "You have somewhere warm for today?" Ruth lifted the thermos. "Define warm." Odessa said, "The library lobby is open until 4 if the librarian on duty does not enforce the 2-hour seating policy." Marjorie's hand rested on Haven's head. "I don't want to leave her." Callan nodded. He did not make promises. Promises were easy to ruin and hard to bury. "I have blankets in the truck," he said. "Food, too. Not enough to solve this. Enough for today." Ruth narrowed her eyes. "You always this cheerful?" "No." "Good. I'd hate to see you in a bad mood." For the first time that morning, the cold did not feel like the only thing standing among them. Callan brought what he had: 2 wool blankets, a sealed bag of dog food Miriam had left, bottled water, canned soup, a small first aid kit, and the spare gloves from his truck. It was not generosity dressed in glory. It was inventory, the kind of help a man could give without yet admitting he cared. Odessa wrote down every item. "For accountability," she said. "For your memoir?" Ruth asked. "For when people pretend later that none of this happened." That sentence stayed with Callan longer than he expected. Haven returned once more to the threshold of room 12 before Callan helped load her back into his truck. This time, Marjorie tucked the burgundy scarf around the dog's neck herself, loose and careful. "You keep it," she whispered. "You found your way with it once." Haven pressed her muzzle into Marjorie's hand. Callan looked away, giving them what privacy a frozen parking lot could offer. When he finally climbed behind the wheel, Haven did not lie down. She sat facing the motel, scarf at her throat, eyes fixed on Marjorie standing beside Ruth and Odessa in the snow. Callan started the engine. No one waved at first, then Ruth lifted the thermos like a salute. Odessa gave a grave nod. Marjorie kept one hand over her mouth as if she were afraid a goodbye might escape and become too final. Callan backed out slowly. As the truck turned toward the frontage road, he glanced in the mirror. Haven had placed one paw against the passenger window. Not scratching, not frantic, just holding herself as close to the glass as she could. Room 12 disappeared behind the motel office. The chained doors remained. The cars remained. The women remained. And somewhere inside Callan, beneath the old discipline and the practiced distance, something that had been sitting down for many years began, reluctantly, to stand. He did not call it anger yet. Anger was too simple. This was older, colder, more careful. It was the feeling of seeing a locked door and knowing there were people on the wrong side of it. Randall Cormac's temporary office sat in the front half of a renovated insurance building on Alder Street, 2 doors down from a tax preparer and across from a bakery that had closed for the season. Callan Brennan noticed the office before he noticed the name on the glass. Not because it was large. It wasn't. Red Basin did not have room for large ambitions unless they wore work boots and carried feed sacks. But Randall's office had been made to look as if winter had no authority inside it. The sidewalk out front had been cleared edge to edge. Salt glittered in a tidy line along the curb. The brass handle on the door shone. Even the welcome mat looked new, black with white letters that read, Cormac Development Group. A man could learn things from a clean threshold. Callan parked across the street and sat for a moment with the engine running. Haven was not with him. That had taken more discipline than he cared to admit. She was back at the cabin, sleeping near the stove after a small breakfast and a long watch at the window. Dr. Miriam Vale had told him no unnecessary travel, no stress, no long exposure to cold until she could examine the dog again. Miriam gave orders the way ranch gates gave splinters, without apology. So Callan had left Haven wrapped in a blanket, the burgundy scarf beside her paws. He had not liked the look she gave him when he shut the door. It was not accusation. Worse, it was expectation. He crossed the street under a pale noon sky. Snowmelt dripped from the bakery awning. A pickup rolled by slowly, the driver lifting 2 fingers from the wheel. Callan nodded back without seeing who it was. Inside, Randall's office smelled faintly of coffee, printer toner, and some expensive pine-scented spray meant to suggest cabins without admitting to sawdust. Framed renderings hung on the wall, a lodge with warm windows, snowmobiles parked neatly outside, a stone fire pit, smiling guests in clean winter coats. Above one rendering, in polished lettering, was the phrase, Sundown Basin Retreat. Coming soon. Callan stood before it. The drawing showed the motel transformed into something handsome and profitable. New siding, big windows, decorative antlers, a sign with tasteful lighting, no cars with quilts over the windows, no old women warming their hands around bad coffee, no German shepherd pressing a scarf against a chained door. Mr. Brennan? The voice came from behind him. Randall Cormac stepped out of an inner room carrying a leather folder. He was 56, tall, narrow, carefully maintained. His steel-gray hair was combed back without a strand out of place. His charcoal wool coat hung from his shoulders, as if it had been tailored by someone who considered weather a personal insult. His shoes were black, polished, dry. That detail settled in Callan's mind. Dry shoes in Red Basin in December required planning. "I'm Brennan," Callan said. Randall offered a hand. "Randall Cormac. I understand you found a dog on or near one of my properties." Not a greeting, a positioning. Callan shook his hand once. Randall's palm was warm and smooth. "Near Starline Diner," Callan said. "Then she took me to Sundown." Randall smiled lightly, as if correcting a child without wanting to embarrass him. Animals wander, especially during weather shifts. She didn't wander. Dogs do not provide sworn testimony, Mr. Brennan. Callan looked at him. Randall's smile remained, but something behind it measured the room. "Please," Randall said, gesturing toward a chair. "Sit." Callan did not. The office window looked out toward the street, where a snowplow passed slowly with its blade lifted. There was a small electric fireplace under one wall, flame effect glowing behind glass. A neat stack of county forms sat on Randall's desk beside a silver fountain pen. "I met Marjorie Finn," Callan said, "Ruth Bellamy, Odessa Pike." "Then you met 3 unfortunate women in a complicated transition. They're sleeping in cars behind your motel." Randall's expression did not change. That was impressive in a small, ugly way. "No one has been asked to sleep in a car," he said. Temporary relocation vouchers were issued. The property was closed for safety inspection due to heating irregularities. I would be negligent if I allowed occupancy under unsafe conditions. Their rooms had heat. According to whom? Them? Randall opened the folder with a soft sigh. Respectfully, long-term occupants often misunderstand the distinction between habit and right. Sundown Motor Lodge had been mismanaged for years. Informal arrangements, pets without authorization, storage violations, deferred maintenance. My company acquired a distressed asset. We are correcting it. By locking out 3 elderly women. By initiating a lawful renovation timeline. Callan's jaw shifted once. He kept his hands loose at his sides. In another life, in another room, men had tried to bait him into becoming the version of himself they could dismiss. Angry veteran, unstable male, threatening presence. Randall had probably already written the sentence in his head, so Callan gave him nothing useful. "The dog belongs to Marjorie," he said. Randall turned one page. No registered animal was listed on her tenancy documentation. She had a microchip. Then I'm sure Animal Control would be interested to review that when appropriate. She was found under a diner sign in a storm. Again, animals wander. Callan stepped closer to the desk, but not too close. "You called her stray animal found on private property." Randall's eyes cooled by 1 degree. "I said that because that is what was reported." "By whom?" "A contractor." "Name?" Randall closed the folder. "Mr. Brennan, I understand this may feel personal to you. Men with service backgrounds often respond strongly to perceived injustice. But this is not a battlefield. It is a civil property matter involving code compliance, tenant responsibilities, and liability." There it was, wrapped in concern, polished like a brass handle. Callan nodded once. "You're right," he said. Randall blinked just slightly. "This isn't a battlefield," Callan continued. "On a battlefield, people usually admit there's a war." For the first time, Randall's smile disappeared. Callan left before the man could recover it. Outside, the cold felt honest. He stood on the sidewalk and looked back once at the rendering through the office glass. Sundown Basin Retreat glowed warmly on paper. Paper was good at that. It could put light in windows where no one had yet been allowed to stand. His phone buzzed before he reached the truck. "Unknown number," Callan answered. "Mr. Brennan?" a woman said. "This is Delia Shore. Marjorie gave me your number. She said you found haven." Delia's voice carried road noise, fatigue, and no wasted softness. It was the voice of someone who had learned to be kind while keeping both hands on the wheel. "I did." "I'm on my way to check on Marjorie. She told me you spoke with Cormac." "Briefly." A pause. "Did you punch him?" "No." "Good. That saves paperwork." Callan looked across the street at the office. "You always lead with optimism?" "I'm a community nurse in winter. Optimism is rationed." He almost smiled. They met 20 minutes later at Red Basin Community Clinic, a low brick building behind the volunteer fire station. Delia Shore came in through the side entrance carrying a Navy medical bag and a paper cup of coffee that looked untouched. She was in her mid-40s, compact and quick-moving, with chestnut hair tied low at the nape of her neck. She wore teal scrubs under a mustard-yellow parka, and her face had the alert exhaustion of someone who slept in fragments between other people's emergencies. She studied Callan for half a second too long. "You look exactly like the kind of man who says he's fine when he's bleeding." "I'm not bleeding." "Then today's off to a heroic start." Delia led him into a small consultation room that smelled of disinfectant and old radiator heat. On the desk sat a folder, a pen, and a consent form already signed by Marjorie Finn in careful, trembling script. "She gave permission for limited disclosure," Delia said. "Admission date, discharge date, mobility notes. Nothing more." "You don't have to convince me." "I'm not convincing you. I'm protecting her." Delia tapped the paper once. "People with money love when helpers get sloppy. Then they make the helper the problem." Callan liked her more than he expected. She showed him what she could. Marjorie had fallen on the walkway outside the motel office. She had first been seen at the clinic, then transferred to Casper for imaging and treatment. Her discharge instructions included limited walking, no icy surfaces, assistance recommended. 3 weeks, Delia said. She was not gone by choice. She did not abandon her room. What happened when she came back? Cormac's office said it was a tenancy issue. I called County Social Services. They had already received documentation from Cormac claiming temporary relocation support was offered and declined. Was it? Technically. Delia's mouth tightened. A voucher for 3 nights at a motel too far away for 3 women with no reliable winter transport and 1 fresh hip injury. On paper, help. In practice, a shove. She leaned back in the chair. For a moment, her professional steadiness slipped, and Callan saw anger under it, banked low. Marjorie kept apologizing, Delia said. That's what stays with me. Not the pain, not the walker, the apologies. She kept saying she didn't want to be trouble. Callan thought of the black garbage bag again, the way children learn to say thank you for not being wanted too loudly. Delia looked at him as if she had noticed the silence change. You know that kind of apology, she said. Callan did not answer. She let it go. That was another point in her favor. Before he left, Delia gave him a name. Nora Whitcomb, County Social Services. She's not the villain, Delia warned, but she's tired, underfunded, and buried alive in procedure. Don't go in swinging. I don't swing much anymore. That sounded like a lie wearing boots. Nora Whitcomb worked out of a county annex that shared space with vehicle registration and weed control. Her office had no pine spray, no renderings, no polished handle. It had a heater that clicked like a jaw and stacks of files arranged with visible despair. Nora herself was 58, short and sturdy, with gray-blonde hair clipped back on one side and glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She wore a sage-green sweater under a brown-gray wool coat and had 3 sticky notes stuck to her sleeve without noticing. She did not look pleased to see Callan. I have spoken with Miss Shore, she said before he sat. I know why you're here. Then we can save time. No, Nora said. We can spend it accurately. That stopped him. She pulled a folder from the stack at her left. The label read, Finn/Bellamy/Pike in black marker. I have not ignored them, she said. I didn't say you did. You were going to. Callan shut his mouth. Nora removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. We have 12 emergency beds in the county program. 4 are offline because the heating contractor hasn't finished repairs. 2 are occupied by medical discharge cases. The women were offered placement separately in different towns. They refused separation. They're safer together. I agree. Nora's voice sharpened, not at him, but at the situation. Agreement does not create beds. The room went quiet except for the heater. Nora opened Cormac's documents. Temporary closure, relocation offer, storage notice, towing receipt, tenant noncompliance. "His paperwork is tidy," she said. "Tidy paperwork delays human urgency. By the time I challenge one line, 3 more arrive." Callan looked at the file. "So what helps?" Nora studied him, reassessing. "Dates that contradict his sequence. Proof Marjorie was medically unable to respond. Proof the rooms were usable. Proof the dog was not stray. Proof the women did not abandon tenancy. Witnesses and records." She put her glasses back on. "Preferably both." By late afternoon, Callan found Earl Voss at a tow yard on the south edge of Red Basin. The place smelled of diesel, cold metal, and old arguments. A white tow truck with an orange stripe sat idling near the fence, paint chipped along the door. Earl emerged from behind it, carrying a chain hook. He was 62, broad through the shoulders, with a belly earned by diner breakfasts and long drives, his gray mustache thick enough to catch snow. He wore a burnt orange canvas coat stained with oil and a black knit cap pulled low over thinning hair. "You Brennan?" Earl asked. "Yes." "If this is about that mercury, I towed it legal." "I didn't ask yet." "You had the face of a man about to." Callan stood beside the truck, hands in his coat pockets. "Marjorie Finn's car." Earl looked away first, toward the yard where old vehicles sat under snow like sleeping animals. "Cormac had paperwork," he said. "I'm hearing that a lot." "Paperwork pays invoices." "Did the dog run after the truck?" Earl's jaw worked once beneath the mustache. For a long moment, the only sound was the tow truck engine and a loose chain clinking against the steel bed. "German Shepherd," Earl said. "Black and gold. Torn right ear. Burgundy scarf." Earl closed his eyes briefly, as if annoyed by the accuracy of memory. "She came out from behind the units when we loaded the last bins," he said. "I thought she belonged to someone else, or she'd circle back. Dogs do." "Did she?" Earl gave him a hard look. "You know she didn't, or you wouldn't be here." The sentence sat between them with frost on it. Earl scratched the side of his face. "I saw her follow us as far as the diner. Snow was coming in. I had a schedule. Don't look at me like that." "I didn't say anything." "That's the problem with men like you. You don't have to." Earl turned and spat into the snow, though without much force. "I got the tow invoice," he said. "And the work order for the bins. Doesn't say dog, wouldn't, but I remember the dog. Would you write that down?" Earl laughed once bitterly. "I didn't ask for sainthood." "No, just the truth." The older man looked toward the line of impounded cars. He seemed smaller for a second, not physically, but in the way people shrink when a memory stops obeying their excuses. "I'll think on it," he said. Callan nodded. It was not a yes, but it was no longer a no. When Callan returned to the cabin, dusk had settled blue over the snow. Haven was awake before he opened the door. She came to him with a limp that was already less severe, sniffed his boots, then looked past him as if checking who had followed. "No one," he said. She carried the burgundy scarf to the door again that night. But this time Callan did not stand behind her helplessly. He placed on the kitchen table the first pieces of what he had gathered: Delia's consent-backed notes, Nora's list of needed proof, a copy of the closure notice he had photographed, and the name Earl Voss written on the back of a receipt. Small things. Paper things? Not enough to open room 12. Enough to mark where the lock had been placed. Haven sat by the door with the scarf at her paws, staring into the dark beyond the window. Callan sat at the table beneath the yellow light, reading each line again. He could still cut a chain faster than he could build a case. That was the old training speaking. But there were doors that broke wider when forced, and doors that trapped the people behind them if opened wrong. So Callan stayed seated. He sharpened a pencil with his pocket knife. Wrote names, dates, questions. He made a list the way he once made maps, not for attack, but for return. Outside, Red Basin disappeared under another light fall of snow. Inside, Haven waited at the door, and Callan began, piece by careful piece, to show the town how that door had been closed. St. Brigid's Stone Chapel sat on a low hill north of Red Basin, built from gray stone hauled out of the creek beds by miners who had believed, with the arrogance of hungry men, that anything heavy enough could be made permanent. Winter had softened the arrogance, but not the stones. Snow lay along the chapel roof in thick white ridges. Ice hung from the gutters like glass teeth. The bell tower rose short and square against the pale sky, less grand than stubborn, and the narrow windows glowed amber from the old furnace struggling somewhere inside. From the road below, the chapel looked like a small ship caught in a frozen sea, lights burning because someone aboard refused to admit the storm had won. Callan Brennan parked beside a row of trucks and aging sedans. Haven lifted her head from the passenger seat before he cut the engine. The burgundy scarf lay loose around her neck, tucked carefully so it would not pull. She had slept more that morning, eaten half a bowl, and tolerated the ride with less trembling than before. But when she saw Marjorie Finn's beige Mercury near the chapel steps, her ears rose at once. "You know," Callan said, "for a dog who needs rest, you have strong opinions." Haven gave him a look that made the sentence feel reviewed and dismissed. Inside the chapel basement, warmth came with noise, not loud noise, not chaos. The kind of human sound Callan had spent years avoiding: chairs scraping, water running, someone laughing too sharply at a bad joke, a spoon tapping the side of a pot, paper bags rustling on folding tables. The basement had low beams, stone walls, a bulletin board crowded with church notices, and an old kitchen tucked behind a half wall. It smelled of coffee, onions, wet wool, and wood polish. Father Amos Reed stood by the stove wearing a gray cardigan over a dark flannel shirt and a brown apron tied badly around his waist. He was 71, thin and slightly stooped, with white hair that had surrendered everywhere except above his ears. His short white beard looked as if he had trimmed it while arguing with the mirror and lost interest halfway through. Around his neck hung a small wooden cross, darkened by years of thumb and prayer. He turned as Callan came down the steps. "You must be Brennan," he said. "You look exactly like a man who dislikes church basements." Callan looked around at the crowded room. That obvious? Only to professionals. Ruth Bellamy, standing at the counter with a knife in one hand and a potato in the other, snorted. Father Amos considers himself a professional at noticing misery and overcooking coffee. "I do not overcook coffee," Amos said. Odessa Pike sat at a folding table beside a stack of papers, her white hair pinned neatly under a green scarf, a pen moving across a legal pad with military precision. "You do not cook coffee at all, technically. You assault it." Marjorie sat near the radiator with a blanket over her knees. She looked smaller in the basement light than she had in the snow, but warmer. Her plum-colored coat hung on the back of a chair. When Haven saw her, the dog moved across the room with careful dignity, not rushing, not stumbling, but with a softness in her whole body that made every conversation pause. Marjorie opened both hands. "There's my girl." Haven put her muzzle into Marjorie's lap. No one said anything for a moment. Even Ruth lowered the potato. Callan stayed near the stairs, suddenly aware of the room as a circle he did not know how to enter. There were tasks everywhere, people folding donated blankets, a woman labeling medicine bags, a man carrying firewood. Delia Shore in her mustard-yellow parka, checking Marjorie's blood pressure with one hand while writing in her orange notebook with the other. Nora Whitcomb at the far table, glasses low on her nose, sorting forms into piles marked housing, medical, transport, and urgent. This was not a briefing. No one stood at the front. No one gave a command. Still, everything moved. That made Callan uneasy. In teams, he knew where to stand. In operations, he knew where every hand belonged. In a church basement full of people doing good without being ordered, he felt like a tool left on the wrong shelf. Delia looked up and caught the hesitation. "Blankets go on the left table," she said. "Canned goods on the right. Men who hover go outside and split wood." Callan nodded. "Wood sounds good." "Of course it does." Father Amos handed him an axe from behind the stairwell. "Try not to look so relieved. It hurts our hospitality." Outside, behind the chapel, Callan split logs beside a small shed while snow fell in light grains from a colorless sky. The work suited him. Lift, aim, strike, clean division. Wood did not speak in forms or apologies. It either split or it didn't. After 20 minutes, the basement door opened. Haven came out. She stood at the top of the steps, scarf hanging crooked, watching him with her torn ear tilted. Behind her, Marjorie's voice called faintly, "Haven, come back, sweetheart." But Haven came down the steps instead and crossed the snow to Callan. She stopped just beyond the swing of the axe and sat. Callan lowered the tool. "You're supposed to be with her." Haven looked at him. The wind moved through the spruce trees behind the chapel. Callan felt foolish for understanding what could not be translated. The dog had found Marjorie. She had warmth, hands she knew, a blanket, a radiator. She had every reason to remain inside. Yet she had come out into the cold because Callan had removed himself from the room. Not as a command, not as duty. As if his absence had become part of her count. He set the axe against the shed. "You keeping inventory now?" Haven's tail moved once, low and slow. It struck him harder than it should have. For most of his life, leaving a room had meant becoming easier to forget. Children learned that in places where adults counted beds, but not goodbyes. Soldiers learned other versions of it. Men like Callan perfected the art of stepping away before anyone could notice the empty space. Haven had noticed. From the basement doorway, Delia watched without interrupting. When Callan looked up, she pretended she had come out only to shake crumbs from a dish towel. "Dogs got opinions," she said. "So I've heard." "She didn't like you being out here alone." "I'm not alone. I have wood." Delia glanced at the neatly split pile. Emotionally rich company. Haven leaned briefly against Callan's leg, then turned toward the steps, as if the matter had been settled. He followed her back inside. Dr. Miriam Vale arrived just after noon, shaking snow from her green field jacket in the entryway. Her red veterinary bag hung from one shoulder. In her gloved hand was a microchip scanner with fresh batteries taped into place as if she had dared the machine to fail again. "Where's the patient?" she asked. Haven, hearing her voice, lifted her head from beneath Marjorie's chair but did not hide. Progress, Miriam noted, with one raised brow. She knelt on the concrete floor, let Haven sniff her hand, and ran the scanner slowly along the dog's neck and shoulders. The room continued its work around them, but quieter now. Odessa stopped writing. Ruth paused at the stove. Callan stood near the wall with his arms folded, though he told himself he was not waiting. The scanner beeped. Haven flinched at the sound. Marjorie touched her shoulder. "Easy, girl." Miriam looked at the screen. For once, she did not speak immediately. "What?" Callan asked. Miriam read the display again, then took a small notebook from her bag and wrote the number down. Registered name, Haven, owner of record, Marjorie Finn. Address, Sundown Motor Lodge, room 12. Marjorie closed her eyes. Ruth whispered something that might have been a prayer or a cooking curse. Odessa reached for a tissue, then used it to clean her glasses instead of her eyes. Callan looked at Haven. The dog had rested her chin on Marjorie's knee as if the beep meant nothing to her, as if humans were very slow at learning what she had known all along. Miriam's voice remained calm, but steel had entered it. This dog was not unidentified. If anyone with a functioning scanner checked, they had a path back to Marjorie. Could they say they didn't know? Delia asked. They can say anything. Miriam slipped the scanner back into her bag. Whether it sounds decent is another matter. Nora came over with a folder pressed to her chest. I'll need a copy of that record. You'll have it, Miriam said, and a statement. Father Amos poured coffee into a chipped mug and set it near Miriam. Medicinal? Miriam smelled it and stared at him. For whom? The living or the condemned? Ruth pointed at her approvingly. I like this one. The small laughter that followed did something tender to the room. It did not erase anything. The women still had cars for bedrooms. Room 12 remained chained. Randall Cormack still had clean paperwork and cleaner shoes. But for a moment, the room contained a fact no one could polish away. Haven had a name, an owner, and an address. By mid-afternoon, the chapel basement had become less a shelter than a quiet headquarters. Odessa copied dates from receipts with priestly concentration. Ruth stirred soup in a pot large enough to bathe a toddler, though she loudly denied caring whether anyone liked it. Delia called the clinic twice, the county once, and a pharmacy in Lander about Marjorie's refill. Nora marked sticky notes and muttered to herself in the language of people trying to turn urgency into acceptable procedure. Callan carried boxes, stacked wood, repaired a loose hinge on the pantry door, and fixed a flickering light over the sink without being asked. Each task gave him a way to stay, without admitting he had stayed. Marjorie asked little. That made the little she asked heavier. My wooden box, she told Father Amos when he sat beside her with coffee. It's not valuable. It has Daniel's photographs, Haven's old vet papers, a receipt from when I bought the scarf yarn. She smiled faintly. He said burgundy was too dramatic for a woman my size. Daniel lacked imagination, Amos said. He lacked color sense, different sin. Ruth wanted her cast-iron pot back from storage and spoke of it like a kidnapped relative. Odessa wanted her lease records, correspondence, and every notice Randall had slid under their doors. Memory, Odessa declared, tapping her notebook, is a noble instrument, but when men in coats begin lying, noble instruments require photocopies. Callan looked around the basement. People here knew how to want specific things, not revenge, not rescue a spectacle. A pot, a box, papers, a dog, a room where the door opened from the inside. It shamed him a little, how long he had reduced home to a lock. The warning came by email first. Nora read it on her phone and went still. Delia noticed. What? Nora's mouth tightened. Cormac's attorney has sent a notice to the church board and the county office. Father Amos removed his glasses from his shirt pocket, though he did not need them yet. That man moves fast for someone with no moral destination. Nora read aloud carefully. The notice accused St. Bridget's of encouraging former tenants to interfere with private property, spreading misleading claims regarding an active renovation site, and potentially exposing vulnerable adults to risk by discouraging proper relocation channels. It also referred to Callan Brennan as a former military individual with no legal standing, inserting himself into a civil property dispute. No one spoke. The words were clean. That was the worst of them. They carried no shouting, no insult crude enough to reject at once. They arranged suspicion with folded hands. Callan felt every eye in the room avoid turning toward him too quickly. He almost laughed. Unstable veteran. It was not written there, not exactly. But the outline was waiting in the sentence, like a trap under snow. Delia's face had gone flat with anger. He's trying to make the helper the hazard. Nora nodded once. And make the women look manipulated. Ruth slammed the spoon down harder than soup deserved. Manipulated? If I were easily manipulated, I'd have married my second husband again. Odessa looked up. "You nearly did." I said easily. The joke broke the pressure, but not the meaning. Callan walked to the far end of the basement, where a county road map had been pinned to the bulletin board for a holiday food drive. Red Basin sat in the center. The Chapel Hill curved north. Sundown Motor Lodge lay near the low stretch of highway, close to the old diner and the gas station. The pass beyond it was marked with a blue line that the Weather Service loved to close. A radio near the kitchen crackled. Father Amos turned it up. A winter storm warning came through in a clipped official voice. Whiteout conditions possible within 48 hours. High winds, dangerous travel, potential closure along the Red Basin Pass and adjacent county roads. Everyone listened differently. Ruth listened like someone calculating soup servings. Odessa listened like someone preparing a list. Delia listened like a nurse hearing future patients in the forecast. Nora listened like a woman watching her already thin options shrink. Callan listened like a man reading terrain. The chapel was warm now, yes, but it sat on a hill reached by a road that iced fast. The women could not sleep in cars through a whiteout. Emergency beds were scattered, limited, and separate. Sundown Motor Lodge, for all its chains and notices, stood at the lowest point near the highway, close to where stranded drivers would end up if the pass closed. The old motel had a kitchen, a common room, 6 eastern units that, according to Ruth, still held heat better than the chapel basement. Randall had locked it in the name of safety. A storm was coming to test the word. Callan looked back across the room. Haven had fallen asleep with her head on Marjorie's shoe and one paw touching the burgundy scarf. Marjorie's hand rested on the dog's neck. Ruth stirred the pot again, quieter now. Odessa had begun writing something at the top of a fresh page. Nora held the legal notice in one hand and her county phone in the other. Delia watched Callan as if she already knew he had found the same question she had. Father Amos stepped beside him and looked at the map. "I suppose," the old pastor said, "that when weather asks a moral question, it rarely waits for the committee agenda." Callan kept his eyes on the map. For 3 chapters of his life, he might have believed doors existed to keep danger out. Now, standing in the basement of an old stone chapel while snow gathered in the gutters and a dog slept beside the woman she had refused to forget, he understood a harder truth. Sometimes the danger was the locked door, and sometimes the only place built well enough to save people was the place someone had decided they no longer deserved to enter. By noon, the sky over Red Basin had lost its patience. The morning began with a deceptive brightness, the kind that made the snowfield shine as if the whole county had been polished clean for judgment. Then the wind shifted. It came down from the ridges with a long, bitter breath, lifted powder from the flats, and drove it sideways across the highway until the road no longer looked like a road, only a pale rumor running through white smoke. At St. Brigid's Stone Chapel, the radio kept repeating the warning in a voice too calm for the weather outside. Whiteout conditions, dangerous travel, possible closure of the pass. Residents advised to shelter in place. Father Amos Reed stood beside the basement stove, one hand on the radio, his gray cardigan buttoned wrong by one hole. "Advised," he said. "That is government language for 'we told you so' before you froze." Ruth Bellamy, who was packing donated bread into paper sacks, did not look up. "Then stop insulting the radio and find more onions." Delia Shore moved between folding tables with her orange notebook open, writing names, medical concerns, phone numbers, medication needs. Nora Whitcomb stood near the wall map with her county phone pressed to one ear and a pencil tucked behind the other. She no longer looked like a woman buried under procedure. She looked like a woman using procedure as a crowbar. Callan Brennan stood at the map, watching the storm erase options. The chapel was warm, yes, it had soup, blankets, people willing to help. But the road up the hill had already gone slick, and visibility from the lower turn had dropped to a few yards. The people at the chapel could stay where they were. The people still out near the highway could not climb a hill they could no longer see. The first call came from the volunteer fire station. A bus had stopped near Starline Diner after the driver lost sight of the shoulder. 2 semis were angled across the frontage road, one with a trailer wheel sunk into the ditch. A pickup had slid into the old gas station lot. No major injuries yet, but the word yet moved through the basement like a draft. Nora ended her call and looked at Callan. Sundown is the closest structure. No one needed to say the rest. Sundown Motor Lodge was locked, chained, and sitting low beside the highway with a common room, a kitchen, and a row of east units Ruth swore still held heat. It was also private property under dispute, wrapped in Randall Cormac's legal notices like barbed wire made of paper. Father Amos took off his glasses and cleaned them on his cardigan. "Well," he said, "morality has poor timing, but weather has worse." They reached Sundown in 3 vehicles, Callan's truck, Nora's county SUV, and Father Amos's old van, loaded with blankets, soup pots, water jugs, bread, and several church volunteers who looked both frightened and offended by the inconvenience of fear. Haven rode with Callan head up, burgundy scarf around her neck. Marjorie stayed at the chapel at first, Delia insisting she not risk the ride until the space was made safe. Ruth and Odessa refused to be left behind. "I know that kitchen," Ruth said from the back seat of the van. "If a man is going to die of cold beside my old stove, he can at least die after being offered soup." Odessa, beside her with a notebook already open, said, "Nobody is dying. I have not prepared the forms." At sundown, the storm made the motel appear and vanish in pieces. The sign groaned over the lot. Snow blasted along the doors and filled the corners of the U-shaped building. Behind the office, the chained entrance to the service lane rattled like a warning. Randall Cormac arrived 5 minutes after they did, stepping from a dark SUV in a charcoal coat, one gloved hand holding his collar against the wind. Even in the storm, his boots looked clean for the first 3 seconds. Then Wyoming corrected them. "What is this?" he called. Nora moved before Callan could. She walked straight to Randall, county badge clipped to her coat, hair whipping loose from its barrette. "This is an emergency sheltering action," she said. "The pass is closing. We have stranded motorists and medically vulnerable adults within a mile of this property. This property is closed for safety inspection. Then you'll be glad we're limiting access to areas verified safe for temporary emergency use." Randall's eyes narrowed. "Verified by whom?" Callan had already crossed to the east row. He tested the first door, checked the jamb, the window, the wall heater. "By someone who knows the difference between a hazard and an excuse." Randall turned toward him. "You have no authority here." "No," Callan said. "She does." He nodded toward Nora. Nora lifted her county phone. "I have the emergency coordinator on the line. I am documenting your objections and the conditions on site. You can cooperate, or you can explain later why you prevented access to shelter during a declared weather emergency." For once, Randall did not answer immediately. The wind did it for him, slamming snow against the office window hard enough to make the old glass buzz. Callan did not wait for permission dressed as Grace. He and Earl Voss cut the ice away from the service door and opened the common room while Nora stayed on the phone and Father Amos unloaded blankets. Earl had appeared without being called, his burnt orange canvas coat darkened by wet snow, his tow truck lights flashing near the road like a pair of tired suns. "Don't look at me," Earl grumbled when Callan glanced over. "Generator won't start itself." "I didn't say anything." "You have that face." "What face?" "The one that makes a man confess things he planned to take to the grave." Callan almost smiled. "Start with the generator." They did not open the whole motel. Callan marked unsafe doors with red tape from Father Amos's van. The west row remained locked, sagging ceiling in 2 units, frozen pipes in another, a smell of damp wiring near the laundry room. The east side was different. 6 rooms could hold heat with the auxiliary system, and the common room had a wood stove insert that, by some miracle or old-fashioned competence, still drew smoke properly. Ruth entered the kitchen like a general reclaiming a captured fort. "Odessa!" she barked. "Count bowls." "Father Amos, if you touch that coffee pot before I say so, I will baptize you in dishwater." "Callan, where's my gas line?" "Checking it." "Check faster. Hunger is a morale issue." Odessa sat up at the front desk with her notebook, 3 pens, a roll of masking tape, and the expression of a librarian preparing to reorganize the afterlife. "Name, vehicle, medical conditions, emergency contact," she told the first stranded driver who stumbled in with snow frozen in his beard. The man blinked. "Ma'am, I just got out of a bus." "Then you are capable of answering questions while seated." He sat. By late afternoon, sundown had begun to breathe. People came in covered with snow, a bus driver with red hands and shaking shoulders, 2 truckers arguing about tire chains until Ruth threatened them both with onions, a middle-aged couple from Idaho whose phone had died, a road worker with a bruised cheek, a quiet older man who kept insisting he was fine while Delia gave him a look that made the lie surrender. Delia created a warming corner near the stove. Blankets first, wet gloves off, slow sips of warm liquid, no crowding the heaters. She moved with brisk calm, teal scrubs visible beneath her parka, mustard hood dusted white. Nora logged arrivals beside Odessa, her county forms finally serving people faster than they slowed them. Marjorie arrived just before dark in Father Amos's van, wrapped in blankets, face pale but determined. Haven knew before the van door opened. She left Callan's side and moved through the common room, weaving past boots and bags, until Marjorie came in on Delia's arm. Haven pressed herself gently against the woman's legs, not jumping, not pulling, only anchoring. Marjorie put one hand on her head. "There you are," she whispered. Ruth saw them and looked away quickly, blaming the onions. The night deepened. Outside, the highway disappeared entirely. The storm took the world beyond the motel windows and turned it into a white wall. Inside, the common room glowed with mismatched lamps, emergency lanterns, and the orange belly of the stove. Soup simmered. Coats steamed on chair backs. Someone began to laugh too loudly from relief, then quieted when another person started to cry. Callan moved constantly, checking doors, clearing snow from vents, hauling wood, helping Earl coax the generator when it coughed, died, and came back with a roar that made everyone cheer. He was used to being useful in emergencies. Useful was safe. Useful did not ask him what he felt. But then he looked up and saw the 3 women. Ruth stood in the kitchen with sleeves rolled to her elbows, ladling soup as if every bowl were a verdict against the cold. Odessa sat at the desk, glasses low on her nose, calling out names and room assignments, remembering who needed medication and who had a dog in a truck. Marjorie sat near the stove with Haven at her feet, speaking softly to a frightened woman from the bus who could not stop shaking. These were the women Randall had considered obstacles. Not weak, not decorative, not burdens waiting to be moved from a balance sheet. They were holding the room together. The thought entered Callan with a force no explosion could have matched. He had spent years believing protection meant standing between people and danger. Sometimes it did. But tonight, protection looked like soup, lists, a warm hand on a stranger's wrist, a dog lying where fear could see her breathing. Near 9, Haven rose from beside Marjorie. Her head turned toward the east hallway. Callan saw it and followed, not because she was performing some miracle, but because she had been listening all evening in ways humans were too tired to manage. She moved down the hall past the first two open rooms, stopped at the third, and scratched once at the lower panel. Inside, a gray-haired truck driver lay on one of the beds, boots still on, coat half unzipped. He had told Odessa his name was Martin Keel, and Delia he was fine. His face looked waxy now, his breathing too shallow. "Delia," Callan called. Delia arrived fast, Nora behind her with a blanket. They warmed Martin slowly, checked his pulse, got him sitting, got broth into his hands. When the man finally opened his eyes properly, Haven sat in the doorway, watching as if she had simply reminded the room to keep count. Martin looked at the dog. "She yours?" Callan did not answer at once. Haven rose and went back toward Marjorie. "No," he said quietly. "She belongs to people who remember each other." The words surprised him. Delia heard them. She said nothing, which was one of her better kindnesses. Later, the wind slammed hard into the kitchen side of the building. A loose panel near the back door tore free and snapped inward, blowing snow across the floor in a white burst. Ruth stepped back just as Haven lunged across the threshold and planted herself between the opening and the stove, barking once, sharp and furious. Callan and Earl fought the panel back into place, while Father Amos braced it with a chair and a prayer that sounded suspiciously like carpentry advice. Ruth stood with one hand pressed to her chest. "I was about to move," she said. "Of course," Odessa replied from the desk, at the majestic speed of pudding. Ruth glared. "I am still holding the ladle, you know." The room laughed then, not because anything was easy, but because laughter had become another form of heat. Near midnight, the worst of the storm settled over them. No one spoke of leaving. People slept in chairs, on mattresses pulled from safe rooms, under quilts from the chapel. The common room smelled of wet wool, wood smoke, soup, coffee, and dog fur. Callan stood at the kitchen entrance, too tired to keep moving, too awake to sit. The motel around him no longer felt dead. It creaked, sighed, warmed, and complained like an old animal surprised to find itself useful again. Randall had called it a distressed asset. Tonight it was an ark with bad plumbing. Haven walked slowly to Marjorie, took the burgundy scarf from her lap, and carried it across the room. Callan expected her to go to room 12. The old pull, the old grief. The door she had guarded like a shrine. But Haven did not turn down the hallway. She walked to the center of the kitchen, between Ruth's stove, Odessa's desk, Marjorie's chair, Father Amos's stack of blankets, Delia's medical bag, Nora's forms, Earl's toolbox, and Callan's boots. There she placed the scarf on the floor. Then she lay beside it. Marjorie covered her mouth. Ruth said nothing. Odessa took off her glasses and held them in both hands. Callan felt the quiet gather, not heavy this time, but warm. The scarf had waited at doors. It had marked absence. It had asked for someone to come back. Now it lay in the middle of a room full of breathing people. Haven rested her chin beside it and closed her eyes. Callan looked around the kitchen, at the steam rising from the pot, at the sleeping strangers, at the women who had been pushed outside, now keeping the inside alive. The storm still ruled the highway. The snow still erased the world beyond the windows. But inside Sundown Motor Lodge, no one was waiting outside anymore. By morning, the storm had moved east, leaving Red Basin under a silence so bright it almost looked merciful. Snow covered the highway in long, wind-carved ridges. The old sign at Starline Diner hung still at last, its broken metal arm packed with ice. Trucks sat where the night had stranded them, half buried and humbled. The world beyond Sundown Motor Lodge had been scrubbed white, but inside the common room the air still held the smell of soup, damp wool, coffee, wood smoke, and too many people who had spent a night learning the same truth. A locked building had kept them alive. Callan Brennan stood by the office window with a mug of coffee gone cold in his hand. He had not slept. Not properly. He had sat for 20 minutes near dawn with his back against the wall, listening to the motel breathe around him. A cough from one room, Ruth's pot lid clinking softly in the kitchen, Odessa's pen scratching through names, Haven's paws clicking once across the floor before settling again beside Marjorie. People were waking now. A bus driver named Lyle kept thanking Ruth Bellamy until she threatened to water down his soup if he said one more sentimental word before breakfast. Martin Keel, the trucker Haven had found going cold in the east room, sat near the stove wrapped in a quilt, looking embarrassed by survival. "That dog saved me some trouble," he told anyone who came close enough. Delia Shore checked his pulse and said, "Trouble is one word for it." Martin looked toward Haven, who was lying by Marjorie's chair with the burgundy scarf under one paw. "She scratched the door, wouldn't quit." "She is persistent," Marjorie said, touching the dog's torn ear. Ruth snorted from the stove. "That is the polite version. The dog has management potential." Odessa Pike had stationed herself at the front desk as if the motel had always required her authority. Her white hair was pinned neatly despite the night, though one strand had escaped and curled near her cheek. She had filled 6 pages of her notebook. Names of stranded travelers, vehicles, rooms used, medical concerns, blankets distributed, calls attempted, calls completed. She had also started a separate page titled "Things Randall Cormack Will Pretend Did Not Happen." Callan saw the heading and nearly smiled. Near the entrance, Nora Whitcomb spoke quietly into her county phone, giving a report to someone whose questions grew shorter the longer she answered them. She stood straighter than she had in her office 2 days before. Her glasses were fogged at the edges, her coat still wet at the hem, but she had the steadiness of a woman who had finally found the lever hidden inside the machine. "No," Nora said into the phone. "The property was not voluntarily opened by the owner. Access was initially refused. Yes, I documented the time. Yes, the emergency coordinator was on the line." She paused and looked through the office window, where Randall Cormack's dark SUV sat at the far edge of the lot, like an unwelcome punctuation mark. "Yes," she said, "there are witnesses." That word moved through the morning. Witnesses, not heroes, not victims, not rumors. People who had seen, warmed their hands, taken soup, watched doors open because someone had forced the question. People who now knew the difference between Randall's clean sentences and the cold bodies those sentences had nearly left outside. By 10 o'clock, the county deputy arrived. Deputy Clara Ames was in her late 30s, broad-faced and practical, with a braid tucked down the back of her uniform collar and snow crusted to the cuffs of her pants. She had the look of someone who had spent the night answering calls from ditches and kitchens and had lost patience for anyone who mistook volume for importance. Randall met her in the parking lot before she reached the motel doors. Callan watched through the glass. Randall wore his charcoal coat, though the storm had finally marked it. Snowmelt stained one sleeve. His hair was less perfect than usual, which somehow made him look more offended than tired. "This situation was handled under protest," Randall said, voice carrying as the door opened. "I want that reflected clearly." Deputy Ames looked at the common room behind him, at the sleeping travelers, the blankets, the stove, the handwritten lists, Ruth carrying a pot with the authority of a judge, Haven lying beside Marjorie. "I'm reflecting a lot of things," she said. Then she stepped around him. The first formal statements were taken at the old front desk. Ruth gave hers while ladling soup, refusing to sit, because official questions are less intimidating when you hold a spoon. She described the east rooms, the working stove, the closed gate, the stranded people, the lack of access until Nora called the emergency coordinator. Odessa gave dates, times, room numbers, and names with the calm precision of a woman who had spent decades returning misplaced books to their proper shelves and now intended to do the same with truth. Delia provided medical notes from the night, mild hypothermia risks, medication concerns, Martin Keel's condition, Marjorie's mobility limitations. She kept her words exact, never dramatic, never loose enough for Randall to twist. Earl Voss took longer. He stood outside the office door for nearly 15 minutes, burnt orange coat zipped to his chin, gray mustache stiff with frost, hands buried in his pockets. Callan found him there staring at the tow truck tracks already filling with blown snow. "You planning to wait until spring?" Callan asked. Earl did not look at him. "Thought about it? Spring has mosquitoes." "That's true." The older man shifted his jaw. "You ever do a thing," Earl said, "and it ain't the worst thing you ever did, not by a mile, but it's the one that keeps standing where you have to look at it?" Callan did not answer quickly. "Yes," he said. Earl glanced at him then, as if the honesty had cost both of them something. "I had a work order," Earl said. "Tow the Mercury, move the bins. Cormac's man said the tenant had cleared out. I saw the dog come around the units when we loaded the last of it. She followed the truck to the diner road. I told myself dogs find warm places." His mouth tightened. "Turns out people say a lot of things to stay decent in their own heads." He went inside and gave his statement. No trumpet sounded. No great confession cracked the sky. Earl sat at the desk, removed his knit cap, and told Deputy Ames what he had seen. That was all. That was enough to make the room feel different. By afternoon, Nora had secured permission for supervised entry into room 12. Not ownership restored, not justice completed, not even close. Just a narrow legal doorway, inspection of essential personal property, identity documents, medical items, and animal records, under county supervision due to emergency displacement. Odessa approved of the wording. "It is not poetry," she said, "but it has teeth." Marjorie did not speak when Nora told her. She only closed her hand around Haven's scarf. The chain came off room 12 with Deputy Ames present, Nora documenting, Randall standing at a distance with his arms folded, and Callan beside the walkway carrying nothing in his hands. He had thought about bringing tools. He had not. This door had waited long enough to be opened without force. When the lock finally gave and the door swung inward, cold, stale air breathed out. Marjorie took one step forward and stopped. The room looked smaller than Callan expected. A narrow bed, a scratch table, curtains drawn stiff at the window, dust on the lamp, a chair overturned near the corner as if someone had moved too quickly, and no one had cared enough to set it right. One wall held pale rectangles where photographs had once hung. Several things were missing. That was plain even before Marjorie whispered them. "My quilt," she said. "The blue suitcase. Daniel's brown coat." Ruth stood behind her, face hard. Odessa opened her notebook. Randall spoke from the walkway. "Items may have been transferred to storage according to—" "Do not," Marjorie said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Everyone turned. Marjorie stood just inside the room, one hand on her walker, Haven pressed against her knee. Her thin face had gone pale, but her eyes held. "Do not say according to anything while I am looking at the place where my life was handled without me." Randall's mouth closed. The room became very still. Callan felt the words enter him like heat, entering frozen wood. Handled without me. That was what the black garbage bag had been. Not poverty, not inconvenience, not even abandonment by itself. It was the particular cruelty of having your life moved by hands that did not ask what anything meant. Haven slipped away from Marjorie then, nose down, moving carefully through the room. She sniffed the bed frame, the baseboard, the corner near the heater. At the far side, she lowered herself with a small grunt and nosed under the bed. Something rolled out, a red rubber ball worn nearly smooth on one side. Haven picked it up gently and carried it to Marjorie. For 1 second, Marjorie looked confused. Then her face broke open, not into collapse, but into recognition. "Oh," she breathed, "you kept that?" Haven placed the ball at Marjorie's feet. Ruth turned away. Odessa removed her glasses. Callan looked down at the small red thing on the dusty carpet. It proved nothing a court would care about. It was not a lease, not a receipt, not a medical record. It had no signature, no timestamp, no official seal. And yet everyone in the room understood it. Something loved had been here. Something loyal had remembered. A room could be stripped, chained, and renamed on a development plan, but under the bed, in the dust, a dog's old toy had waited like a tiny stubborn planet, refusing to leave orbit. By late afternoon, the emergency county meeting filled a conference room that usually hosted budget reviews and arguments about snowplow routes. Folding chairs lined the walls. Stranded travelers who had not yet gone home came to speak. Church volunteers came. Delia came with her notes. Doctor. Miriam Vale came with Haven's microchip record and a blunt veterinary statement. Earl came in his orange coat, cap in his hands. Ruth brought soup in a thermos because she distrusted county coffee. Odessa brought a folder thick enough to intimidate architecture. Callan stood at the back. He had no desire to speak. That surprised no one and disappointed only Father Amos, who believed all quiet men were secretly saving speeches for inconvenient moments. Randall spoke first. He called the storm response a cooperative emergency use of private property. He emphasized his concern for safety. He described Sundown as a distressed asset, undergoing responsible redevelopment. Nora stood next. She was not dramatic. She was better than dramatic. She read times, calls, refusals, room conditions observed, medical risks, number of people sheltered. She recommended an immediate freeze on commercial renovation activity, pending review of displacement practices and emergency housing implications. Father Amos requested that St. Brigid's Stone Chapel be allowed to coordinate temporary winter refuge operations in the safe portion of the motel, under county oversight. Delia proposed weekly health checks for vulnerable residents and stranded travelers when storms closed the pass. Dr. Miriam confirmed Haven's registered owner and stated that the dog's physical decline was consistent with recent displacement and exposure. Earl spoke last among the witnesses. His voice was rough, annoyed at itself, but steady enough. "I saw the dog follow the truck," he said. "I didn't stop. I should have." No one absolved him. That made the statement cleaner. Then Odessa rose. The room, perhaps sensing danger, quieted. She placed a handwritten list before the council. Elderly residents in the outer Red Basin area, living in cars, sheds, trailers without heat, or unstable rentals. Names, ages, known medications, last confirmed addresses, sources of concern. She did not plead. She catalogued. When a community loses track of its elders, Odessa said, it should not call that efficiency. It should call it a missing persons report written very slowly. Callan looked down. Haven, lying at Marjorie's feet, lifted her head at Odessa's voice. The council did not decide everything. Real life rarely had the decency to conclude in one meeting. But they decided enough. Commercial redevelopment at Sundown would be suspended pending review. The Safe East units and common room could remain available under temporary winter emergency oversight. St. Brigid's would coordinate volunteers. Nora would file for winter housing support. Randall's storage and towing practices would be examined. A separate inquiry would review whether tenants had been properly notified and accommodated. Randall's face remained controlled. Only his hand changed, tightening around his silver pen until the knuckles paled. After the meeting in the hallway outside, he approached Callan. People were leaving around them. Boots squeaked on wet tile. Ruth argued with Father Amos about returning her thermos. Nora spoke into her phone. Marjorie sat on a bench with Haven's head on her lap. Randall stopped beside Callan close enough to speak privately. "What do you get from this?" he asked. Callan looked at him. Randall's voice remained soft. "You don't own the motel. You don't know these women. You don't gain anything but trouble." Callan turned his head toward the open doorway, leading back to the meeting room. Inside, Odessa was correcting a council clerk's spelling of Bellamy. Delia was showing Nora a medication schedule. Father Amos was trying to carry 3 boxes at once and failing with dignity. Ruth was tasting soup from her thermos as if county government required seasoning. Marjorie was laughing quietly at something Haven had done with the red ball. The sight did not feel like victory. It felt like a room that had been cold too long, beginning to remember heat. Callan looked back at Randall. "Maybe," he said. "I'm learning the thing you priced too low." Randall's eyes narrowed. "And what is that?" Callan did not answer. He did not need to. Behind him, Haven rose, crossed the hallway, and leaned against his leg as if closing the sentence herself. Sundown Motor Lodge did not become beautiful overnight. The morning after the county order, the roof still sagged in places. Paint still peeled from the office trim in long, tired strips. The parking lot remained cracked beneath snow and ice. The old sign by the road still leaned slightly west, as if the whole thing had grown weary of facing the wind head-on. Nothing about it looked redeemed in the way people like to imagine redemption should look. There were no shining new windows yet, no ribbon ceremony, no smiling photograph in the county paper with everyone arranged neatly enough to pretend the trouble had been tidy. Randall Cormack was not dragged away in disgrace. He was still making calls through an attorney, still using phrases like procedural overreach and temporary mischaracterization of asset use. But his commercial renovation was frozen pending review. His storage invoices were being examined. His towing orders had become part of a county file. And for 90 winter days under emergency oversight, St. Bridget's Stone Chapel would coordinate use of Sundown's safe east wing, common room, and kitchen as a temporary refuge. The name on Nora Whitcomb's paperwork was plain: Sundown Winter Lodge. Odessa Pike objected to the lack of poetry. "It sounds like a form," she said, sitting at the front desk with a ledger open before her. Nora, who was sorting applications into labeled folders, did not look up. "It is a form. Forms should aspire. Forms should be approved." "Civilization declines by increments," Odessa said, and wrote the name anyway in careful block letters across the top of the new register. The register became her kingdom. No one entered without giving a name, a phone number if they had one, medication notes if needed, vehicle description if stranded, and destination if they were passing through. Odessa wrote everything down. She also wrote people out when they left safely, which she considered equally important. A person should not disappear from a list simply because the weather improves, she told a young snowplow mechanic who had tried to leave without signing out. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and returned the pen with both hands. Ruth Bellamy took command of the kitchen in a manner that made democracy unnecessary. She found 3 dented stockpots, rejected 2 as unfit for civilized beings, then accepted them by necessity after a lecture on the moral decline of cookware. She organized shelves by what could become soup, what could become breakfast, and what could become soup if breakfast failed. On the second day, she taped a sign above the stove. "If you complain, you chop onions." Father Amos Reed read it, nodded solemnly, and said, "Scriptural?" "It is now," Ruth replied. Marjorie Finn returned to room 12 under the temporary order, not because everything was restored, but because someone had finally written down that she had a right to be there while the matter was reviewed. The room was still cold at the edges. Some belongings were missing. Her blue suitcase had not been found. Daniel's brown coat remained in storage somewhere behind a fee Randall's office had not yet explained, but the wooden box was back. Callan had watched her open it at the small table near the window. Inside were photographs, Haven's old vet papers, a receipt for burgundy yarn, a folded church program from Daniel's funeral, and a postcard from Yellowstone with handwriting that had faded almost to mist. Marjorie did not cry then. She only touched each thing once, as if proving the world had not swallowed it completely. Haven sat beside her chair, the red ball between her paws. The dog had gained weight slowly. Her coat still bore the roughness of exposure, but the honey gold along her chest had begun to shine again. The torn ear would always tilt. The scar on one paw pad would always make her careful on ice. Yet there was a new steadiness in the way she moved through the lodge. She was not patrolling. Not exactly. She was counting. Marjorie, Callan, Ruth in the kitchen, Odessa at the desk. Delia's medical bag by the wall, Father Amos by the door, Earl outside near the sign, swearing at bolts, everyone still there. Only then did Haven rest. Delia Shore arrived every Tuesday and Friday with her orange notebook, a medical bag, and the expression of a woman determined to make compassion inconvenient for bureaucracy. She set up a small health table in the common room, blood pressure checks, medication reminders, wound care, referrals, questions asked softly enough that pride could survive answering them. "Hydration is not optional," she told Earl one afternoon. "I'm not one of your patients." "You're a man over 60 drinking coffee like it's a food group. You're practically a volunteer patient." Earl scowled and drank water. "Doctor." Miriam Vale came once a week when roads allowed, partly to check Haven, partly because word had spread that Sundown Winter Lodge allowed travelers to keep animals inside during storms if they were leashed, calm, and not trying to eat Ruth's bread. Miriam vaccinated a terrier belonging to an old couple from Rawlins, checked a cat with frost-nipped ears, and declared Father Amos's coffee unsuitable for mammals. The old pastor accepted this as persecution. Earl Voss never apologized in a way anyone could frame. He simply showed up. He fixed the loose gutter over the office, replaced the latch on the side door, rewired the exterior light near the east row. Then he turned his attention to the sign by the road, working from a ladder in wind that made younger men invent indoor errands. The sign still said Sundown Motor Lodge, though the letters were faded and the metal face had cracked near the bottom. Earl removed the broken bulbs, scraped rust, replaced wiring, and cursed each screw with personal specificity. Callan held the ladder. "You know," Earl said without looking down, "I could have stayed home." "You didn't? That ain't gratitude I'm hearing, is it?" "No." "Good. I'd hate to be encouraged." Callan looked up at the old sign. "You going to make it say Winter Lodge?" Earl tightened a bolt. "Eventually. For now, I'm making it not kill anyone in a breeze. Grand visions can wait until the wiring stops trying to murder me." That was how the place changed. Not in one triumphant sweep, but in small corrections. A door that latched. A stove that drew properly. A form filed before deadline. A window sealed with plastic against the cold. A list of volunteers. A schedule for snow clearing. A shelf of donated gloves. A phone number written large for stranded drivers. A coffee pot replaced after Ruth declared the old one a crime scene. Callan became caretaker because no one could find a better word. He did not sign up for it with ceremony. Nora asked who could be listed as on-site maintenance contact for the 90-day emergency order. Everyone in the room looked at him. He hated that. Then the east hallway light flickered above them, and he hated that more. "I can keep things working," he said. Odessa wrote it down. Temporary caretaker, Callan Brennan. The title embarrassed him, so naturally Ruth used it whenever possible. "Caretaker," she called one morning, "this shelf is leaning like a politician under oath." "Use my name." "I am. It says caretaker on the paper." He fixed the shelf. Still, there were moments when the title followed him into quieter places. At night, after the kitchen emptied and the last travelers signed in, Callan walked the hall with a flashlight, checking doors, heaters, windows, locks. It was familiar work: perimeter, conditions, points of failure. But the meaning had changed. He was no longer securing a space from people. He was securing it for them. That difference unsettled him more than danger ever had. He slept in a small back room off the office, on a narrow cot beside a toolbox and a stack of folded blankets. The room smelled of old paper, pipe dust, and pine cleaner. It was not his cabin, not his property, not permanent. Yet every evening, Haven made the same journey. She would leave Marjorie's room after the woman settled in, walk through the kitchen to accept whatever Ruth pretended not to drop, check Odessa at the desk, pass Father Amos if he was locking the chapel van, then arrive at Callan's door. She would step inside, sniff the cot, look at him once, and lie down in the doorway for 10 minutes before returning to Marjorie. The first time, Callan thought she was confused. The third time, he understood she was not. Haven had become the thread between Room 12 and the back office, between the woman who had lost her room and the man who had never trusted one. She did not choose one belonging over another. She stitched them together with pause and patience. One evening, Father Amos found Callan repairing a hinge on the kitchen pantry door. The old pastor carried a small object wrapped in a dish towel. "I made something," Amos said. "That's usually a warning." Only to the joyless. Callan took the towel. Inside lay a small wooden cross, rough but carefully shaped. The grain was dark along one edge where the wood had been scorched. "From the back kitchen door," Amos said. "The piece the storm cracked. Earl said it was scrap. I disagreed, which is one of my few spiritual gifts." Callan stared at it. He was not a church-going man, not from rebellion, more from distance. Faith had always seemed like a house with singing coming through the windows, something he passed by in the cold without knowing the door code. Amos seemed to read that in his silence. "It's not to make this place a church," he said gently, "and it's not to make you into something you are not. It's just a reminder. Some broken pieces can still hold a wall." Callan ran his thumb along the scorched edge. For no reason he wanted to name, he thought of a black garbage bag on a porch, a dog under a broken sign, a scarf at a locked door, and a red ball rolling from beneath a bed. "I'll find a place for it," he said. "That is all most of us are doing," Amos replied. The final snow of that week came softly, not the hard white violence of the storm, but a slow, bright fall that made the afternoon appear newly made. Sundown Winter Lodge glowed under it with all its flaws visible, patched window plastic, uneven porch boards, smoke from the kitchen vent, Earl's ladder still leaning by the sign, tire tracks half filled in the lot. Inside, Ruth was making soup again, because Ruth considered soup not a meal, but a civic philosophy. Odessa sat at the desk correcting Father Amos's spelling on a supply form. "It is not bandages," she said. "It looked right when I wrote it." "That is not a defense." Delia was arranging a pill organizer for Martin Keel, who had returned to thank everyone and then been trapped by her medical concern. Nora stood nearby, arguing into her phone about winter housing funds with the grim cheer of a woman enjoying a righteous administrative fight. Marjorie sat near the window, sewing the frayed edge of the burgundy scarf. Haven lay under the table, with her head on Callan's boot. Callan stood by the kitchen wall, holding the wooden cross. No one announced the moment. That helped. He chose a space between the old pantry door and the bulletin board where Odessa had pinned the sign and rules. He drove one small nail, set the cross on it, and stepped back. The cross was not polished. It did not shine. The scorched edge remained visible. It looked like what it was, a broken piece given another job. Marjorie saw it first. "That suits the room," she said. Ruth glanced over. "Everything suits this room. The room has low standards and a good stove." Odessa looked up. "That may be the best description of civilization I have heard this winter." Delia came to stand beside Callan with her notebook in hand. "Nora needs an address for the winter contact list." "For who?" For you." She kept her tone ordinary, which made it more dangerous. "On-site caretaker, emergency maintenance. Overnight contact." Callan looked at the form. Name: Callan Brennan. Winter contact address: such a small blank. He had filled blanks like that all his life. Foster home, barracks, forward operating base, rental, cabin road, places that held him without claiming him. Places he could leave before they asked too much, or he did. Delia waited. So did the room, though kindly enough to pretend it was not waiting. Haven rose under the table. She walked to Marjorie, took the burgundy scarf gently from the woman's lap, and carried it to the middle of the kitchen. Not to the front door. Not to room 12. Not to Callan's cot. The middle? She placed it on the floor between the stove, the desk, the cross, the medical table, the pantry, Marjorie's chair, and Callan's boots. Then she leaned her head against his knee. Callan felt something inside him give way, but not like breaking, more like a latch finally lifting. He looked around the kitchen. Marjorie's sewing basket sat by the window. Ruth's spoon rested across the pot. Odessa's ledger lay open. Father Amos had one hand on the back of a chair, smiling without making the mistake of speaking. Nora was watching over the top of her glasses. Earl's muffled voice came from outside, insulting the sign into compliance. Delia held the form and waited. Callan looked at the small wooden cross on the wall, then at Haven. "Write this address," he said. Delia did not move too fast. "The lodge?" Callan nodded once. "My winter address is here." Ruth, who had been pretending to stir soup, whispered loudly, "That's not a complete sentence of emotional growth, but we'll accept it." Odessa said, "I will record it as adequate." Marjorie laughed, soft and full of relief. Delia wrote the address. Outside, snow kept falling, gentle as ash from a kinder fire. Callan looked down at Haven. The dog's amber eyes were half closed, her body warm against his leg. She had carried the scarf from the door to the center of the room. She had done what no order, no title, no county form could do. She had shown him the difference between a place that locked and a place that held. For years, Callan Brennan had believed home was a word people used when they had never learned how quickly doors could close. Now an old motel breathed around him. A pot simmered. A ledger waited. A woman sewed a scarf. A pastor's rough cross held to the wall. Somewhere outside, a man in an orange coat cursed a sign back to life. And no one was outside waiting to be allowed in. Callan rested one hand on Haven's head. For the first time, the word home did not feel like a lie. Sometimes healing does not arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes quietly, through a warm bowl of soup, an open door, an old scarf carried by a faithful dog, and a room where no one is left outside in the cold. Callan thought a home was only a place with a lock. But Haven, Marjorie, and the people of Sundown reminded him that a true home is where someone notices when you are missing, and where grace makes room for one more weary soul. May we all learn to keep a little fire burning for someone who has been standing too long in the storm. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, hope, and the quiet miracles that still find us.